Enola spelled backwards. Horse. House.
Yes.
That
Let's attack!
Far from the busy streets of England, tucked away on the quiet edge of the countryside, stands the Holmes family estate. Years ago, the father of the family passed away, and not long after, the two eldest sons went off to build lives of their own. Now the old house is mostly occupied by only 3 people: Eudora Holmes, her youngest child Enola, and the household maid who helps keep the place running. Enola's name is no accident. It is the word alone, written backward, chosen by Eudora because she adores puzzles, hidden meanings, and clever wordplay. But there is more behind the name than a simple game. Eudora wants her daughter to grow into someone who can survive independently, think for herself, and never depend on anyone else to define her place in the world. Enola has lived a very sheltered life in terms of geography. She has never traveled beyond the woods surrounding their home, never visited a proper town, and has certainly never experienced the chaos of a large city. Still, her mother has made sure she is far from ignorant. Instead of raising her like a typical young lady, Eudora has filled her days with lessons in science, books, history, athletics, strategy, and even fighting techniques. Their bond is unusually strong, almost more like partners than simply mother and daughter. Even so, Eudora is not an open book. There are parts of her life she keeps hidden from Enola. More than once, Enola has noticed strange gatherings inside the house where her mother meets secretly with other women behind closed doors. She does not know what they discuss, but she understands enough to realize Eudora has a world of secrets she has never been invited into. Then, on the morning of Enola's 16th birthday, everything changes. She wakes up expecting the day to begin like any other celebration, only to discover that her mother has vanished during the night. Eudora has left no explanation, no goodbye, and no clear clue to where she has gone. The only thing waiting for Enola is an unusual birthday present, a small box containing a book about the meaning of flowers, a cipher device, and several hand-painted cards made by Eudora herself. With no other answers, Enola heads to the train station to meet her older brothers, Mycroft and Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock, of course, is already famous as a brilliant detective, and Enola hopes that between the two of them, they may know how to find their missing mother. But it has been so many years since the siblings last saw one another that when the brothers arrive, they do not even recognize her at first. Once they realize who she is, the reunion becomes uncomfortable almost immediately. Mycroft, the eldest, is horrified by nearly everything he sees. He criticizes the neglected condition of the estate, but what bothers him far more is Enola herself. In his eyes, she lacks every quality expected from a respectable young woman. Her manners, her clothing, her speech, and her confidence all offend him. Sherlock, meanwhile, approaches the matter differently. He inspects Eudora's room with the calm precision of a detective searching for signs of violence or struggle. After looking over the space, he concludes that nothing suggests she was taken against her will. Eudora left by choice, and from the evidence, Sherlock believes she had no intention of coming back anytime soon. Later that evening, Enola secretly listens as her brothers talk while playing billiards. From their conversation, she learns that the family estate has technically belonged to Mycroft ever since their father died. Eudora had merely asked to use the house for 16 years so she could raise Enola there. The discussion also reveals the distance between the brothers. Mycroft points out that Sherlock has barely bothered with the family and has only returned now because a mystery has caught his attention. As far as Mycroft is concerned, there is only one sensible solution for Enola. She must be sent away to a finishing school where she can be corrected, disciplined, and trained to behave like a proper lady of society. The next day, Mycroft's plan arrives in the form of Miss Harrison. She is a strict, cold, and intimidating instructor hired specifically to transform Enola into something more acceptable. From the moment they meet, Enola despises her. Miss Harrison sees Enola not as a person to be guided, but as a problem to be broken down and rebuilt. She wants to change the way Enola stands, speaks, dresses, thinks, and behaves. Enola, however, is not the type to quietly accept humiliation. When Miss Harrison talks down to her, Enola answers back sharply and without fear. The confrontation escalates, and Harrison responds by slapping her. Shocked and furious, Enola turns to Mycroft and pleads with him to stop this, but he refuses to bend. In his mind, this is discipline, and discipline is exactly what she needs. Desperate, Enola goes to Sherlock instead, hoping he will intervene. But Sherlock tells her that his hands are tied. Under the law, Mycroft is her guardian, and that means the decision belongs to him. Enola is deeply hurt by this. She accuses Sherlock of stepping away from responsibility when it matters most, reminding him that he has always ignored Mycroft's harshness, even when their mother was the one suffering from it. Needing to clear her head, Enola slips away from the house and climbs into a tree to draw. Sherlock eventually finds her there and joins her. For a moment, their conversation softens. He tells her a story from when she was little, one she does not remember. As a child, Enola apparently had a pine cone wrapped in wool that she called Dash, and she used to drag it around everywhere as if it were a pet dog. But the warmth does not last long. Enola challenges Sherlock again, pointing out that he never comes home. When he tries to explain that his work keeps him busy, she counters that he never even writes. Sherlock says their mother's disappearance is a mystery, but that only irritates Enola further. To her, Eudora is not a case to be solved. She is her mother. Sherlock calmly tells her that if she truly wants to see what is in front of her, she cannot let emotion cloud her judgment. That evening, Enola returns to the strange birthday gift, determined to examine it more carefully. Remembering how much Eudora loves riddles and word games, she begins rearranging the letters from one of the messages. Eventually, she uncovers a hidden instruction from her mother telling her to look at one of Eudoria's paintings. Following the clue, Enola checks behind the canvas and finds an envelope tucked out of sight. Inside is money, along with another card painted by Eudoria. To Enola, this changes everything. Her mother has not simply abandoned her without thought. She has left a trail, and Enola believes she is meant to follow it. So, that night, Enola makes her decision. Dressed in old clothes that once belonged to Sherlock, she sneaks out of the house under cover of darkness and begins her own search. By the following day, she reaches the train station. While there, she notices members of the noble Tewkesbury family anxiously looking for their missing son. The family themselves do not board her train, but one of their men, Linthorne, does. Enola keeps moving and finds an empty carriage, hoping for a quiet journey. But the carriage is not empty for long. To her shock, a young man suddenly emerges from inside a travel bag. He introduces himself as Viscount Tewkesbury, the very boy his family is searching for. He explains that he paid a porter to smuggle him onto the train because he is trying to run away from his relatives. Enola, however, has no patience for his problems. She has her own mission, and she refuses to let some runaway aristocrat ruin it. After warning him that Linthorne is on the train, she throws him out of the compartment. Only seconds later, Tewkesbury comes rushing back in, shaken and frightened. He has seen Linthorne moving from carriage to carriage, searching for him. Enola decides that if he will not leave, then she will. But she barely manages to get away before she hears a struggle behind her. Linthorne has found Tewkesbury and is attacking him. Enola hesitates for only a moment before guilt and instinct pull her back. She rushes into the carriage and strikes Linthorne with his own cane, interrupting him just as he is about to throw Tewkesbury from the moving train. Enola grabs Tewkesbury in time, saving him from falling, and the two of them race through the train corridors with Linthorne close behind. As they run, Enola quickly realizes they have no real escape route. The train is moving fast, the danger is closing in, and staying on board means getting caught. So when the train passes over a stretch of open grass, Enola makes the only choice left. She and Tewkesbury jump. Meanwhile, back at the Holmes estate, Sherlock continues searching the house for clues. But now the mystery has grown larger. Their mother is gone, and Enola has disappeared too. To Sherlock, it begins to look as though his little sister's escape may be another piece of the same puzzle. The housekeeper does not let Sherlock's theory pass without comment. She points out that he is reducing Enola's disappearance to a puzzle, exactly the way Enola had accused him of doing with their mother. Then she tells him something important. Before leaving, Enola made sure to leave money behind for her. The gesture proves this was not some reckless, childish tantrum. Before Sherlock goes, the housekeeper asks him not to fail his sister again, especially now that Mycroft is already preparing to involve the police. Meanwhile, Enola and Tewkesbury are still far from safety. After their dramatic escape from the train, the two teenagers decide that traveling together is the smartest option, at least until they reach London. As night falls, they make camp outdoors, and Tewkesbury proves that he is not as helpless as Enola assumed. Using the survival knowledge his late father taught him, he searches the area and gathers edible plants for them to eat. By the fire, the tension between them begins to soften. They talk about their families, both strange in different ways, and about the fear of being forced into lives that do not belong to them. Enola understands that Tewkesbury is not simply running from responsibility. Like her, he is trying to escape a future someone else has designed for him. To make him less recognizable, she cuts his hair, changing his appearance enough to help him avoid anyone searching for the missing young lord. The next morning, they manage to catch a ride toward London. Once they arrive in the city, the two separate, each continuing on their own path. For Enola, London is overwhelming from the first moment. She has never seen anything like it. The noise, crowds, carriages, streets, and endless movement all press in on her at once. On top of that, the city is filled with political unrest. Protesters crowd the streets, some demanding support for the reform bill that could give women a voice in voting, while others loudly oppose it. Everywhere she looks, the world seems to be arguing about change. There is another problem, too. Posters of Tewkesbury's face are spread across the city, offering a reward for information about him. Enola realizes immediately that being connected to him could make her mission even more dangerous. Her first priority is to disappear in plain sight. Since she knows exactly how Mycroft would describe her to the authorities, wild, improper, unfeminine, and impossible to manage. She decides the best disguise is the opposite of herself. She buys respectable ladies' clothing and transforms into the kind of young woman no one would expect Enola Holmes to be. At the same time, Sherlock is making a decision of his own. He refuses to take on the official case of Tewkesbury's disappearance because, in his mind, finding his mother and sister matters more. Mycroft objects, but Sherlock ignores him. Then he spots a possible lead in the newspaper, a report about two boys who jumped from a moving train. The detail catches his attention, and he begins to suspect Enola may have been involved. After securing her new clothes and renting a room in London, Enola begins the next stage of her search. She places coded messages in the personal advertisements section of the newspaper, hoping her mother will understand them. Then she visits the only address she has ever seen Eudora write to, a tea house. Once inside, Enola hears strange sounds coming from upstairs. Curious, she follows the noise to the first floor and discovers something unexpected, a jiu-jitsu academy for women run by Edith. Enola soon realizes that Edith is not a stranger. She had been one of her earliest teachers, though Enola was too young at the time to remember her clearly. More importantly, Enola recognizes Edith as one of the women who attended Eudora's secret meetings at the Holmes house. Enola tries to question her, but Edith refuses to reveal what Eudora is doing or where she might be. Frustrated, Enola attempts to force answers out of her physically. But when she tries to use the special corkscrew move she was taught, she fails to execute it properly. Edith handles her with ease, proving that Enola still has much to learn. Before leaving, Enola notices something disturbing, a box filled with dynamite. On it is a symbol that matches the markings on a box she once saw during one of Eudora's secret gatherings at home. The discovery sends her mind racing. She remembers a few odd words she overheard during those meetings, and once again, she rearranges the letters like a puzzle. The hidden message reveals an address, and Enola wastes no time going there. When she arrives, she finds a door marked with a purple ribbon tied around the lock, the same kind of ribbon the women at Eudora's meetings wore. Enola climbs in through a window and discovers a hidden workspace inside. There are pamphlets, equipment, chemical materials, and crates of explosives. Piece by piece, the truth becomes clearer. Eudora is not merely involved in political reform. She appears to be leading a radical group of suffragettes willing to use dangerous methods for their cause. But before Enola can leave, Linthorne appears and attacks her. He forces her head into a bucket of water, demanding to know where Tewkesbury is hiding. Enola insists she does not know, but Linthorne does not believe her. Thinking quickly, she pretends to drown. The moment his guard drops, she strikes back. A fight breaks out between them. Enola tries once again to use the corkscrew technique, but once more she cannot pull it off. Linthorne overpowers her and shoves her deeper into the laboratory, then comes at her with a knife. The blade should have killed her, but her corset absorbs the strike and saves her life. Using the chemicals around her, Enola creates a reaction that sets off the explosives, giving her the chance to escape. Now that she knows Linthorne is in London, Enola realizes Tewkesbury is in serious danger. Whatever this man wants, he is willing to kill for it. Feeling responsible, she decides she must warn Tewkesbury before Linthorne finds him. Disguised as a widow, Enola travels to the Tewkesbury family estate. Once there, she claims to be working as Sherlock Holmes's assistant. For a moment, Tewkesbury's mother seems close to believing her. Unfortunately, Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard is also present, and as someone who knows Sherlock personally, he quickly exposes the lie. Enola and Lestrade begin arguing, and the situation becomes so uncomfortable that Tewkesbury's mother orders both of them to leave. Outside the estate, Enola changes tactics. She approaches the gardener and asks about the places Tewkesbury liked most. Then, to keep moving without being recognized, she pays the gardener to swap clothes with her. While Enola continues her search, Sherlock follows his own trail. Using letters Eudora had hidden in the chimney back at the house, he eventually finds Edith as well. She tells him that Enola is safe, but beyond that, she refuses to give him answers. Edith makes it clear that Sherlock does not understand the importance of what Eudora and the others are fighting for. When Sherlock admits he finds politics dull, Edith sharply challenges him. In her view, that is exactly the problem. Men like Sherlock can afford to be bored by politics because the world already works in their favor. Why would he feel urgency to change a system that serves him so comfortably? Mycroft, meanwhile, is conducting his own business. Lestrade meets with him and confirms that the young woman he encountered at the Tewkesbury estate was indeed Enola. Mycroft is furious, but also determined. He promises Lestrade a generous reward if he can catch her and bring her back. Back with Enola, she makes her way into the forest near the Tewkesbury estate and eventually finds Tewkesbury's treehouse. Inside, she discovers that he has planted false clues about where he might be going, clearly hoping to mislead his family. But Enola looks more carefully and finds another clue hidden inside a book, one that points toward his real destination. Before she can follow it, her investigation is interrupted by Tewkesbury's grandmother, the Dowager. The older woman appears calm and composed as she guides Enola out of the woods. As they walk, she speaks proudly about the role she believes her family has been given, to protect England's greatness, its traditions, and its ideals. Then she studies Enola and calls her a new thinker. She says it almost like a warning, noting that both her son and grandson shared that same dangerous quality. To the Dowager, people like them do not simply question the world, they threaten to change it. Enola's next stop is Covent Garden, where she finally tracks Tewkesbury down. Instead of hiding in some grand estate or secret room, he is working among the flower stalls, selling blooms like an ordinary boy trying to vanish into the crowd. Enola wastes no time. She warns him that Linthorne is in London and that his life is still in danger. What she does not realize is that the hunt has now expanded. Posters with her own face have started appearing around the city too, turning her from investigator into fugitive. Enola brings Tewkesbury back to her hotel, where she explains what she discovered at his family's estate. The clues in the woods suggest his father's death was not a simple accident after all. It was murder, and now whoever arranged it wants Tewkesbury dead as well. The motive, Enola believes, is greed and power. Someone benefits if the young Viscount never takes his place. Before they can decide what to do next, the danger arrives at the door. Inspector Lestrade has tracked Enola down after the seamstress who sold her the dress reported her for the reward. Thinking fast, Enola throws a teapot at him and drags Tewkesbury into her room. Together, they shove a heavy chest against the door, trying to keep Lestrade out for as long as they can. But Enola knows the barricade will not hold. With only seconds to choose, she makes a sacrifice. She tells Tewkesbury to escape through the window while he still can. In her mind, the consequences are not equal. If she is caught, she will be forced into boarding school. If he is caught, he may be killed. Tewkesbury manages to get away, but Enola is captured. She is handed over to Mycroft, who is furious and humiliated by everything she has done. He takes her money, scolds her harshly, and leaves her devastated, reduced to tears. Soon after, Enola is sent to the boarding school Mycroft chose for her. From the moment she arrives, she does not belong. Every lesson feels like a punishment. The girls are trained to become graceful, quiet, obedient, marriageable young ladies, and Enola despises every second of it. The classes teach posture, manners, domestic skills, and how to secure a respectable husband. Everything Enola has spent her life being taught to question. At night, Miss Harrison locks Enola inside her room. She takes pleasure in reminding Enola that Eudora left her behind, insisting that her mother cared more about her political mission than her own daughter. The words cut deeply, even if Enola does not want to show it. One afternoon, Sherlock comes to visit her. He tells Enola he has found Edith and the hidden laboratory, but he still has not located Eudora. Enola snaps at him, exhausted by the way everyone keeps turning her life into an investigation. She is tired of being treated like evidence instead of a person. Sherlock, more vulnerable than usual, admits that he does care about her. Enola notices the rare emotional honesty immediately and teases him for sounding so unlike himself. Sherlock also knows she became involved in the Tewkesbury case, but that is not the real reason he has come. Before leaving, he gives her something small but meaningful. Dash, the old pine cone wrapped in wool from her childhood. Eudora had kept it hidden beneath her pillow all these years. For Enola, that single object says more than any explanation could. Her mother did love her. Her mother remembered. Sherlock also leaves behind that day's newspaper. The article mentions that the Lords are preparing to vote soon, and Enola begins to recognize the shape of another clue. But before she can follow the thought, she is interrupted by a delivery supposedly sent by Mycroft, a huge, heavy basket. When she opens it, Tewkesbury is inside. He has come to rescue her. Enola climbs into the basket, and Tewkesbury begins wheeling it out of the room. Unfortunately, they run straight into Miss Harrison. Thinking quickly, Tewksbury repeats the lie Enola used before, claiming the basket is a private gift from Mycroft meant only for Miss Harrison to open alone. The trick works long enough for the basket to be taken to Harrison's office. Later, when Miss Harrison finally opens it, Enola is gone. The only thing waiting for her is a ridiculous cartoon Enola left behind as a parting insult. In truth, Enola escaped through the office window. Outside, she reunites with Tewksbury, and the two flee in Miss Harrison's car. Their plan is supposed to be simple: return to London. But Enola changes course. To solve the case, she believes they must take a dangerous risk and confront Tewksbury's family directly. She is convinced the person behind everything is his uncle, who stands to gain from Tewksbury's absence. Tewksbury is due to inherit his seat and vote in the upcoming reform decision, just as his father had intended to do. If both father and son supported reform, then someone opposed to that change would have a strong reason to remove them. By the time Enola and Tewksbury reach the family mansion, night has fallen. The estate is strangely silent. No servants, no relatives, no movement. The emptiness feels wrong, and Enola quickly understands why. They are expected. Linthorne appears without warning and fires at them with a rifle. Enola and Tewksbury dive for cover behind the statues, trying to stay out of the line of fire. When Linthorne moves closer, Enola launches herself at him, but he overpowers her and knocks her unconscious. Tewksbury attacks next, but he is no match for Linthorne either. Linthorne forces him down and begins choking him, preparing to kill him by suffocation. Just when it seems Tewksbury is finished, Enola wakes up. She throws herself back into the fight, and this time, everything Edith taught her finally comes together. She executes the corkscrew move properly at last, sending Linthorne crashing backward into the banister. He strikes his head and collapses, dying after claiming that he served England. Then the real mastermind steps out of the shadows. It is the Dowager. Tewksbury's grandmother reveals herself as the person behind the murders. She killed her own son, and now she has come to kill her grandson, all because she believes she is protecting England's traditions from people who want to change them. To her, reform is not progress, it is a threat. Without hesitation, she shoots Tewksbury. Enola rushes to him, horrified, believing he has been killed right in front of her. But then Tewksbury reveals the truth. He is alive. During Enola's fight with Linthorne, he had put on a piece of armor taken from one of the statues, and it stopped the bullet. With her plan exposed and no escape left, the Dowager finally surrenders. The next day, Sherlock visits Lestrade and tells him he has solved the Tewksbury case. By studying clues hidden in the newspapers, he worked out that the Dowager was responsible. Lestrade then informs him that Enola already reached the answer first. Sherlock does not say much, but the news clearly pleases him. His little sister has proven herself. Meanwhile, Enola is offered a place to stay with Tewksbury and his mother. It is a kind offer, and for the first time in a while she has the option of safety and comfort. But she turns it down. Her search for Eudora is not over, and she cannot stop now. She does, however, accept the reward money. Before parting ways, Enola and Tewksbury promise they will see each other again. Then Enola buys a newspaper and notices a cryptic message signed as Mother. She immediately suspects it is a trap set by Sherlock, but she goes to the meeting place anyway, carefully, from a distance, and without letting herself be seen. There she watches as her two brothers wait for her. Mycroft is in an especially foul mood because Tewksbury's vote has helped the reform pass. Frustrated and defeated, he gives up trying to control Enola and accepts Sherlock's offer to become her guardian instead. After that, he asks to leave. As Sherlock walks away, he notices Dash sitting on a nearby statue. Instantly, he understands. Enola was there the whole time, watching them. When Enola returns to the new hotel where she has been staying, she finds the surprise she has wanted most. Eudora is waiting in her room. Mother and daughter embrace, and Eudora finally explains herself. She did not leave because she stopped caring. She left because she was trying to build a better world for Enola to live in. She cannot stay for long because her fight is not finished, but before leaving again, she tells Enola how proud she is of everything she has done. This time, Enola understands. Her mother has chosen her purpose, her brothers have chosen theirs, and now Enola has found her own. She will become a detective. Not just someone who solves puzzles, but someone who finds people who have been lost, forgotten, or left behind. When I first heard about Enola Holmes, I had the same reaction a lot of people probably did. Wait, Sherlock Holmes has a sister? And honestly, that's where the movie's biggest challenge begins. Not because it's a bad idea. Actually, it's a pretty clever one. The problem is that Sherlock Holmes isn't just another fictional character. He's one of those rare literary figures who has been adapted, reimagined, reinvented, and dissected so many times that audiences arrive with a very specific set of expectations. Mention the Holmes name and people immediately start thinking about impossible deductions, intricate mysteries, pipe smoke, eccentric brilliance, and that familiar dynamic between Sherlock and Watson. Enola Holmes walks in the opposite direction. This isn't really interested in being another Sherlock Holmes story, at least not in the traditional sense. The movie borrows the world, borrows the famous surname, borrows a few familiar faces, and then quietly shifts the spotlight somewhere else entirely. That decision is probably going to determine whether the film works for you before the story even starts. A lot of viewers came into this expecting a mystery led by Sherlock Holmes and found themselves watching something completely different. Others seemed relieved by that choice. Instead of trying to compete with decades of Sherlock adaptations, the film carves out its own corner of the universe and lets a new character take control. What's interesting is how divided people are on the very existence of Enola herself. For some viewers, introducing a previously unknown Holmes sibling feels like unnecessary revision. Sherlock and Mycroft have existed for generations as established characters, and suddenly revealing a brilliant younger sister can feel like the sort of addition that was never really needed. There's a feeling among some longtime Holmes fans that the mythology was already complete, but then there are viewers who looked at the same idea and saw opportunity. Because let's be honest, how many times can you tell the Sherlock Holmes story before you start looking for a new angle? We've had countless versions of Sherlock. We've seen him as a Victorian detective, a modern consultant, an action hero, a tortured genius, a social misfit, even a recovering addict. At some point, the more interesting question isn't what Sherlock is doing. It's what happens when you look at that world through someone else's eyes. That's where Enola becomes valuable. The movie isn't trying to replace Sherlock. It isn't trying to prove she's smarter than him every second she's on screen. Instead, it asks what life might look like for someone growing up in the shadow of such an enormous legacy. Someone connected to that famous family but still trying to figure out who she is, and that shift in perspective gives the film a very different identity. The Holmes name definitely helps get people through the door, but once the movie gets moving, it becomes clear that this isn't a detective story built around Sherlock Holmes. It's a coming-of-age adventure that happens to exist inside the Holmes universe. Whether that's a brilliant creative decision or an unnecessary detour seems to depend entirely on the viewer. What's undeniable, though, is that the film commits to that idea from the beginning. It doesn't spend its time trying to convince you that Enola belongs beside Sherlock. It simply places her at the center of the story and lets the audience decide for themselves. And in a strange way, that's what makes Enola Holmes feel different from so many franchise spin-offs. Most spin-offs spend half their runtime reminding you of the property they're connected to. This one seems much more interested in building its own identity. The result is a film that sits in an unusual place. It's connected to one of the most famous literary worlds ever created, yet it often feels far more concerned with carving out its own path than living in Sherlock's shadow. And before we even get into the mystery, the performances, or the film's larger themes, that's probably the most important thing to understand about Enola Holmes. This is not a Sherlock Holmes story that happens to feature Enola. It's an Enola Holmes story that happens to feature Sherlock. So once the movie establishes that this is Enola's story and not Sherlock's, it has a pretty simple job: make us care about her. Fortunately, it doesn't take very long. Before the mystery even begins, we're given a glimpse into a life that already feels a little unusual. Enola grows up largely isolated from the world, living with her mother in the countryside while her famous older brothers are off living their own lives. And right away, there's this sense that her childhood hasn't followed the rules society expects. She's not being trained to become the perfect Victorian lady, no endless lessons on etiquette, no preparation for some future marriage arrangement. Her mother has other ideas. What I found interesting is that the film doesn't present this upbringing as some magical fantasy. It's a little odd, a little unconventional, sometimes even chaotic. But that's exactly why it works. You get the feeling that Enola has been raised to think for herself before anything else. She's taught to question things, to observe, to solve problems, to be curious, and honestly, curiosity ends up becoming one of the most important parts of her character. Then, the movie pulls the rug out from under her. On the morning of her 16th birthday, she wakes up and discovers that her mother has vanished, just gone. No emotional goodbye, no explanation waiting on the kitchen table, no reassuring message saying everything will be okay. Only clues. And from that moment, the entire story changes direction. What I actually liked about this setup is that the mystery feels personal before it feels exciting. The missing person case isn't some random puzzle handed to a detective. It's her mother, the one person who has shaped every part of Enola's life. That emotional connection gives the story something to hold on to whenever the plot starts wandering elsewhere. Because let's be honest, the film eventually introduces quite a few moving pieces. New characters show up, side stories emerge, assassins appear, political issues creep into the narrative. There are moments where the movie seems tempted to chase every idea at once. But underneath all of that, Enola is still trying to answer a very simple question. Where is her mother, and why did she leave? At the same time, her disappearance creates another problem. Enola suddenly has to deal with her brothers. And this is where the story gets some of its early tension. Sherlock and Mycroft return to assess the situation, but instead of finding comfort in family, Enola finds herself facing an entirely different future than the one she wants. The contrast is pretty immediate. The life she had with her mother was built around freedom and independence. The future being planned for her feels structured, controlled, and predetermined. It's one of those situations where you can almost understand why she decides to run before anyone even says the words out loud. The movie doesn't spend much time debating the choice. Enola sees the direction her life is heading. She sees the expectations waiting for her, and she bolts. That's really when the adventure begins. Not because she's trying to become a detective, not because she wants to prove she's the smartest person in the room, not because she's chasing some grand heroic destiny, at least, not yet. Initially, she's just a girl looking for the one person who understands her. I think that's why the setup works as well as it does. Underneath all the mystery elements and the Holmes family connections, there's something surprisingly relatable at the center of it. That feeling of suddenly being pushed into the world before you're ready, having to make decisions for yourself because nobody else can make them for you anymore. The film wraps those ideas inside a Victorian adventure, sure, but the emotional foundation is pretty universal. And by the time Enola boards that train and starts moving toward London, the movie has already done something important. It's given her a reason to leave home that feels bigger than solving a case. She's searching for answers, obviously. But she's also trying to figure out who she's going to become without her mother standing beside her. And that's the real journey the movie is setting up, whether it realizes it or not. One thing that became clear pretty quickly while watching Enola Holmes-ish is that the movie's success lives or dies on a single question. Do you enjoy spending time with Enola? Because she's not just the lead character, she's the engine, the fuel, the steering wheel. Half the time, she's practically the entire vehicle. And thankfully, the film seems to understand that. What I found refreshing about Enola isn't that she's presented as some flawless genius who can outsmart every person she meets. Actually, some of the more interesting moments happen when she doesn't have everything figured out. She makes mistakes. She misjudges people. She gets herself into situations she probably shouldn't be in. Sometimes she survives through quick thinking. Sometimes through pure determination. Occasionally through a little bit of luck. And honestly, that's part of what makes her work. The movie could have very easily fallen into the trap of turning her into a miniature version of Sherlock Holmes. Just younger. Just female. Problem solved. But that's not really what they're doing here. Enola feels different. She's observant, sure. Curious, too. She notices details other people miss. But her perspective comes from a completely different place. Sherlock usually walks into a room and seems 10 steps ahead of everyone. Enola feels like she's actively learning while she's moving forward. There's a sense of discovery to her. Not just discovering clues, discovering herself. That might sound overly sentimental, but the movie spends a surprising amount of time exploring who she is outside of the mystery. She's constantly caught between different versions of herself. The person her mother raised her to be. The person society expects her to become. The person her brothers think she should become. And then there's the version she's trying to figure out for herself. That's where the character becomes more interesting than the actual detective story at times. The mystery gives the plot direction, but Enola's personal growth gives it emotional momentum. And what's clever is that the film rarely separates those two things. Every clue she follows forces her into unfamiliar situations. Every obstacle teaches her something. Every decision pushes her further away from childhood and a little closer toward independence. Even when the story gets messy, and occasionally it does, her journey remains easy to follow because the emotional objective never really changes. She's trying to take ownership of her own life. That's the battle underneath everything else. The detectives, the assassins, the missing persons, the family arguments, all of it eventually circles back to that. Now, whether the film handles those ideas with complete subtlety is another discussion entirely. There are definitely moments where the themes are written in pretty bold letters. The movie isn't exactly whispering its message, but I do think Enola herself keeps those themes grounded, because she doesn't come across as someone delivering speeches. She comes across as someone trying to navigate a world that already has plans for her before she's even had the chance to make any herself, and that's a much more relatable conflict than the movie sometimes gets credit for. It's also worth mentioning that Enola isn't written as someone obsessed with proving she's better than Sherlock. In fact, the film seems surprisingly uninterested in turning their relationship into a competition. A lesser version of this story probably would have spent 2 hours trying to convince us that she's secretly smarter than everyone around her. Instead, the film mostly focuses on her becoming confident enough to trust her own instincts. That's a much stronger character arc, because intelligence alone isn't really the challenge she's facing. Confidence is, freedom is, identity is. By the time she's running across London chasing leads, escaping danger, and piecing together clues, the most important transformation isn't happening in the mystery at all. It's happening inside her. She's gradually becoming the person her mother believed she could be, not because someone handed her that future, because she chose it. And looking back, I think that's probably why Enola connected with so many viewers, not because she's another Holmes, not because she's solving crimes, but because she's written as someone who's still figuring things out. There's something inherently engaging about watching a character learn who they are in real time instead of already having all the answers, especially in a story where everyone around her seems convinced they already know exactly who she should be. Now, I've talked about Enola as a character, but honestly, none of that really matters if the person playing her can't make the audience buy into it. And that's where Enola Holmes gets incredibly lucky, because this movie asks a lot from Millie Bobby Brown. Actually, scratch that. It asks almost everything from her. She's in nearly every scene. The story is told through her perspective. She's carrying the emotional side of the movie, the comedy, the mystery, the narration, the action sequences, the coming-of-age elements. Pretty much all of it lands on her shoulders. If that performance doesn't work, the entire movie probably falls apart. What's impressive is how effortless she makes it look. One thing I noticed while watching is that Brown never seems like she's trying to convince the audience that Enola is clever. A lot of actors, especially in detective stories, fall into that trap. They start performing intelligence instead of simply embodying it. You can almost see the effort happening. Here, it feels much more natural. Enola notices things because she's curious. She asks questions because she genuinely wants answers. Her intelligence feels like part of her personality rather than a character trait that's constantly being announced, and I think that's a big reason why the audience tends to stay on her side even when the plot occasionally wanders. She's just easy to spend time with. That sounds simple, but it's actually one of the hardest things for a lead actor to accomplish. You can have a brilliantly written character, but if viewers don't enjoy following them for 2 hours, the whole thing becomes a chore. Brown never lets that happen. There's an energy she brings to the role that keeps scenes moving even when not much is happening narratively. Sometimes she's funny, sometimes she's frustrated, sometimes she's scared, sometimes she's quietly figuring something out. The movie shifts between those moods constantly, and she manages to make all of them feel like the same person rather than different versions of the character stitched together. And then there's the fourth wall breaking. I'll be honest, I usually don't love that device. A lot of films use it as a shortcut. Characters glance at the camera, throw out a joke, and suddenly the audience is supposed to feel connected to them. It can get old very quickly. But somehow, Brown makes it work. When Enola turns toward the camera, it doesn't feel like she's performing for us. It feels like she's sharing something with us. There's a small difference there, but it's important. The best moments aren't even the funny ones. They're the little expressions, the moments where she realizes something before everyone else, the flashes of confidence mixed with uncertainty. those tiny reactions do a lot of heavy lifting throughout the film. You start feeling less like an observer and more like a companion tagging along in the adventure. And that's not easy to pull off. What surprised me most, though, is how much warmth she brings to the role. Because Enola could have been written as the kind of character who always has an answer for everything. The kind of protagonist who's constantly proving everyone wrong. Instead, Brown gives her vulnerability. She's capable, but she's not invincible. Confident, but not fearless. Independent, but still searching for guidance. Those contradictions make her feel human. There's also something interesting about how she handles the film's more overt themes. The script isn't exactly subtle about what it wants to say. At times, the messaging is pretty direct. Yet Brown rarely plays Enola like she's delivering a statement. She plays her like a teenager trying to navigate her life, and because of that, the character feels more authentic than she otherwise might have. Honestly, there were moments where I found myself staying invested in scenes almost entirely because of her presence. Not because the mystery had suddenly become more interesting, not because some huge plot twist had arrived, just because I wanted to see how Enola would react. That's usually the sign of a strong lead performance, when the character becomes more compelling than the mechanics of the story itself. And judging by how many people came away from Enola Holmes with completely different opinions about the plot but almost identical praise for Brown's performance, I don't think I'm alone in that observation. In a movie where viewers disagree about the mystery, the pacing, the themes, the historical accuracy, and even the interpretation of the Holmes mythology, one thing seems to unite almost everyone. Millie Bobby Brown is the reason this film works as well as it does. You can debate almost every other aspect of Enola Holmes-ish. Her performance is the closest thing the film has to a consensus. Of course, no matter how much weight Millie Bobby Brown carries here, Enola Holmes-ish still needs a supporting cast that feels like it belongs in the same world. And thankfully, this is one area where the film is pretty well stocked. What's interesting is that almost everyone enters the movie with different expectations depending on which character they're looking forward to seeing. For some people, it's Sherlock. For others, it's Helena Bonham Carter. Some probably clicked play because Henry Cavill's face was on the poster, and that's part of what makes the supporting cast discussion so interesting, because almost every major character ends up generating a completely different reaction. Let's start with Sherlock. Honestly, if you're expecting Sherlock Holmes to dominate this movie, you're probably setting yourself up for disappointment. He's not absent, but he's definitely not the focus. The film seems very aware that it can't let Sherlock steal attention from Enola, so it keeps him mostly on the sidelines. What surprised me was how differently Cavill approaches the character. This isn't the hyperactive machine gun intellect we've seen in some adaptations. It's not the eccentric whirlwind version. It's not the socially abrasive genius either. Instead, Cavill plays him with a surprising amount of restraint. In fact, gentle is probably the word that came to mind most often while watching. And that worked for some viewers, not for all of them. There are definitely people who wanted more edge, more intensity, more of that classic Holmes arrogance. I understand that criticism. When a character has existed this long, people inevitably develop a picture of who he should be. But I never got the feeling Cavill was trying to out Holmes' previous versions of Sherlock. He seemed more interested in showing a side of the character that we don't usually see, a version capable of empathy, a version capable of affection, particularly when it comes to Enola. Whether that interpretation works for you will probably come down to personal preference, but I did find the sibling dynamic more interesting than I expected. Then there's Mycroft, and this is where things get complicated, because if there was one character that seemed to divide viewers more than any other, it was him. The issue isn't really Sam Claflin's performance. Most of the criticism I've seen isn't aimed at the actor at all. It's aimed at how the character is written. For many viewers, this version of Mycroft barely resembles the one they know from Holmes stories. Instead of feeling like Sherlock's intellectually formidable older brother, he often functions more as an obstacle standing in Enola's path. A representative of rules, tradition, expectations, authority, all the things she's trying to escape. From a storytelling perspective, you can understand why he's there. The film needs resistance. It needs someone pushing against Enola's independence. But I also understand why some longtime Holmes fans weren't thrilled with that approach. It feels less like an interpretation of Mycroft and more like a completely different character wearing Mycroft's name tag. Now Helena Bonham Carter has the opposite problem. Not enough screen time. She's one of those actors who can leave an impression even when she's barely around, and that's basically what happens here. The entire story revolves around her absence, yet her presence hangs over almost every scene. That's actually a tricky thing to pull off. The audience has to believe that Enola would cross the country searching for this woman, and Carter makes that believable almost immediately. You understand why Enola loves her. You understand why losing her matters. Even when she's off screen, she's still influencing the story. That's a pretty effective use of a supporting character. Then there's Tewksbury, and I have to admit, I wasn't entirely sure what I was going to think of him when he first appeared. Characters like this can sometimes become dead weight in adventure stories. They exist purely so the protagonist has someone to talk to. Thankfully, the movie avoids that problem for the most part. Tewksbury brings a different energy into the story. He's awkward, sheltered, occasionally clueless, but he's also surprisingly likable. More importantly, he allows us to see another side of Enola. Around him, she isn't always investigating or fighting or escaping danger. Sometimes she's just a teenager trying to figure things out as she goes. Those quieter interactions help balance the larger adventure. And then, beyond the main players, there's something else worth mentioning. This movie is filled with familiar faces. Maybe not all household names, but the kind of actors who show up and immediately make a scene feel more lived in. Teachers, detectives, aristocrats, allies, enemies, small roles that could have easily been forgettable, end up adding texture to the world. It's one of those casts where even minor characters feel properly cast. Nobody feels wildly out of place. Nobody feels like they're acting in a completely different movie. That's harder to achieve than people realize. Not every supporting character gets enough development. Some are definitely more interesting than the amount of screen time they receive. A few feel like they could have been explored further if the movie had been willing to slow down. But overall, the cast does exactly what it needs to do. They create a world around Enola without pulling attention away from her. And that's important because this movie constantly walks a delicate line. It wants the audience to enjoy spending time with Sherlock Holmes. It wants us to be intrigued by Mycroft. It wants us to care about Euphoria, Tewksbury, and everyone else. But at the end of the day, it can never let us forget whose story this really is. The supporting cast strengthens the journey. Millie Bobby Brown remains the destination. For all the conversations surrounding the mystery, the feminism, the Sherlock Holmes connections, and everything else people tend to debate about Enola Holmes, I kept coming back to something much simpler. This is, at its core, a family story. Not always an obvious one. Not always a sentimental one, but a family story nonetheless. What's interesting is that the movie doesn't build its emotional foundation around people spending time together. In fact, it does almost the opposite. Most of the important relationships in the film are defined by distance, absence, separation, or misunderstanding. And somehow, that works. Take Enola and her mother. The entire movie begins with a disappearance, but the emotional impact doesn't come from the mystery itself. It comes from the fact that Enola genuinely loves this woman. That sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised how many adventure films skip that step. They tell us a character misses someone without ever convincing us why that person mattered in the first place. Here, even though Helena Bonham Carter isn't on screen for huge portions of the film, you constantly feel her influence. It's in the way Enola thinks, the way she approaches problems, the confidence she has in herself, even the mistakes she makes. You get the sense that Euphoria didn't just raise her, she shaped her worldview. So when Enola starts chasing clues across the country, it never feels like she's solving a puzzle for the sake of solving a puzzle. She's searching for a person, a parent, the one constant in her life. And I think that's why the mystery remains emotionally engaging, even when some viewers found the detective elements themselves less compelling. Because the emotional question is often stronger than the investigative one. Where is her mother? That's important. But the deeper question becomes, what happens when the person who defined your entire world suddenly isn't there anymore? That's a much harder thing to solve. And honestly, that's where Enola's real journey begins. Because once her mother disappears, she's forced into relationships she hasn't really had to deal with before, namely, her brothers. Now, Sherlock and Mycroft are fascinating because neither of them fully understands Enola, at least not initially. Mycroft sees responsibility, rules, structure, duty. He's looking at Enola and thinking about what society expects her to become. Sherlock, meanwhile, spends much of the film observing from a distance. He understands more than he says, but he's also not exactly rushing in to solve everything for her. and that creates an interesting dynamic. Neither brother really occupies the role that Euphoria left behind. They're family, but they don't fully know her. She doesn't fully know them either. There's an awkwardness there that actually feels believable. Sometimes family relationships are messy like that, especially when years of separation are involved. You can share the same name, the same history, even the same bloodline, and still feel like strangers in certain ways. The film touches on that more than people often give it credit for. One thing I appreciated is that Enola's relationship with Sherlock doesn't become some predictable rivalry. The movie could have easily turned everything into a competition. Who's smarter? Who's the better detective? Who's the real Holmes? Instead, it takes a more interesting route. What gradually develops between them is recognition. Sherlock begins to see parts of himself in Enola. Enola starts understanding that her brother may not be as emotionally distant as she originally believed. It's subtle, not always perfectly developed, but it's there. And it gives some of their scenes a warmth I wasn't really expecting. The truth is, for a movie about independence, Enola Holmes spends a lot of time talking about connection. That's the contradiction at the center of the story. Enola wants freedom. She wants control over her own future. She wants the right to choose who she becomes. But she doesn't stop needing people. She doesn't stop caring about family. She doesn't stop searching for belonging. Those things exist side by side. And that's probably why the emotional side of the movie feels more relatable than some of its larger themes. Most people haven't chased assassins through Victorian England. Most people haven't uncovered political conspiracies. But almost everyone understands what it feels like to grow up and realize the people who shaped you won't always be there to guide you. At some point, you have to decide who you're going to be on your own. That's the emotional transition the film keeps returning to. Not the mystery, not the action, not even the detective work. It's the uncomfortable process of stepping out from under someone else's protection and discovering whether you can stand on your own. And beneath all the clues and adventures, that's what gives Enola Holmes its emotional center. It's a story about finding a missing mother, but it's also a story about learning how to live without one. Now, this is probably the point where opinions on Enola Holmes start to split more dramatically, because once you get beyond the adventure, the mystery, and the family dynamics, the movie becomes very interested in discussing something else: identity, freedom, expectation, and, most obviously, the role of women within the world Enola is growing up in. The funny thing is, I don't think anyone watches this movie for more than 15 minutes without realizing exactly what it's trying to say. Enola Holmes is not subtle, not even a little bit. The film wears its themes right on the surface. It doesn't hide them behind layers of symbolism or leave audiences debating what the message might have been. It pretty much tells you directly. For some viewers, that's one of the movie's strengths. For others, it's one of its biggest weaknesses. And honestly, I can understand both reactions, because there are moments where the film feels genuinely sincere in what it's exploring. Enola has been raised differently from the girls around her. She's been taught to think independently, solve problems, question authority, and trust her own judgment. Then she steps into a society that already seems to have a detailed plan for what her future should look like. And that conflict feels real. Not because most people today are being shipped off to Victorian finishing schools, obviously, but because almost everyone has experienced some version of that pressure at some point. The feeling that expectations have been decided for you before you've had the chance to decide anything for yourself. Parents, schools, society, careers, relationships. The specifics change, but the idea remains recognizable. That's where I think the movie is strongest. When it's focused on Enola's personal struggle. When it's less interested in making a statement and more interested in showing how those expectations affect an actual person. Because at its best, the film isn't really arguing that Enola is extraordinary because she's a girl. It's arguing that she deserves the freedom to become whoever she wants to become. That's a much more universal idea. The challenge is that the movie occasionally stops trusting the audience to understand that on their own. There are stretches where the messaging becomes very direct. Characters explain things. Themes get verbalized. Subtext sometimes graduates into regular text, and that's where reactions start to vary. Some viewers found those moments empowering. Others felt they were a little heavy-handed. What's interesting is that both responses seem completely understandable depending on what you're looking for from the film. If you're approaching Enola Holmes primarily as a family adventure aimed at younger audiences, the clarity probably makes sense. The themes are accessible, easy to understand, easy to connect with. But if you're coming in expecting a more layered mystery or a more subtle period drama, those same moments can feel a little blunt. The film definitely knows who its audience is, and it rarely apologizes for speaking directly to them. There's also another layer to the conversation that popped up quite a bit whenever people discuss the movie: historical authenticity. Or maybe historical interpretation is the better phrase, because some viewers looked at the film's version of Victorian England and felt it was filtering the past through a very modern lens. Others argued that the movie was less interested in creating a perfect historical recreation and more interested in using the period as a backdrop for ideas that still resonate today. Again, where you land on that probably depends on what you're hoping to get out of the experience. Personally, I never got the impression that Enola Holmes wanted to be a strict historical document. The tone is too playful, too stylized, too openly adventurous. This isn't a dusty museum exhibit pretending to be entertainment. It's entertainment first. Everything else comes second. That doesn't mean every creative choice will work for every viewer, but it does help explain why the movie approaches its themes the way it does. And honestly, one of the reasons these conversations became so prominent is because the film places them front and center. You can't really separate Enola's journey from the ideas the story is exploring. They're connected. The mystery exists because of those themes. Her conflicts with Mycroft exist because of those themes. Her relationship with her mother exists because of those themes. Even her decision to leave home is tied to those themes. Whether you agree with the execution or not, the movie commits to its perspective. It knows what it wants to talk about, and in fairness, there are plenty of films that never figure that part out. What I find most interesting looking back is that the strongest thematic moments aren't necessarily the loudest ones. They're often the quieter scenes. The moments where Enola isn't making speeches or challenging institutions. The moments where she's simply choosing for herself, choosing where to go, choosing who to trust, choosing what kind of future she wants. Because that's really what all of this comes down to. Not politics, not debates, not arguments, choice. The ability to decide your own direction instead of having someone else decide it for you. That's the idea sitting underneath almost every major decision in the film. And whether viewers loved the movie, disliked it, or landed somewhere in the middle, that central theme is probably the one thing nobody walked away missing. Now here's where Enola Holmes becomes a really interesting movie to talk about. Because for a film connected to the Holmes name, the mystery might actually be the thing people disagree on the most. And that's kind of ironic. You hear Holmes, and your brain automatically starts preparing for elaborate deductions, hidden clues, impossible puzzles, and those satisfying moments where every little detail suddenly clicks into place. That's the legacy attached to the name. The problem is that Enola Holmes isn't really operating in that lane most of the time, or at least not entirely. The movie absolutely contains mysteries. In fact, it contains more than one. The search for Enola's missing mother is obviously the central thread at the beginning, but before long, another mystery enters the picture through Tewkesbury, and suddenly the story is juggling multiple investigations at once. And I think that's where reactions started splitting. Some people enjoyed the constant movement. There's always another clue, another chase, another lead to follow. The movie rarely sits still for very long. Others felt the opposite. They felt like every time one mystery started building momentum, the film would drift toward the other one. You start focusing on the mother. Then you're focusing on Tewkesbury. Then you're back to the mother. Then there's another threat, another clue, another diversion. The film keeps moving, but sometimes it feels like it's moving sideways instead of forward. What's interesting is that the mystery itself often feels secondary to Enola's journey. And I don't necessarily mean that as criticism. I think it's a deliberate choice. Traditional Sherlock Holmes stories tend to build toward the puzzle. The mystery is the destination. Everything exists to support that final revelation. Here, the mystery often feels more like a vehicle. It's giving Enola somewhere to go, someone to meet, something to learn. The clues matter, but they're usually less important than how Enola changes while following them. That approach works for some viewers because it keeps the focus on character. For others, especially people hoping for a classic detective experience, it can feel a little unsatisfying, and I understand that reaction. There were definitely moments where I found myself wishing the film would slow down and really dig into the investigative side of things, not necessarily make it darker or more complicated. Just give the mystery a little more room to breathe, because some of the clues are solved pretty quickly. Some revelations arrive with less impact than the setup promises, and occasionally the film seems far more interested in getting Enola to the next adventure than letting us fully enjoy the process of solving something alongside her. That's an important distinction. A great mystery doesn't just reveal answers, it makes the audience feel clever for noticing things, or foolish for missing them. Either way, you're participating. With Enola Holmes, I often felt like I was accompanying Enola rather than actively investigating with her. Again, that's not necessarily wrong, it's just different, and I think that's why some viewers described the mystery as simple, while others found it perfectly enjoyable. They're judging it by different standards. If you're looking for intricate detective work, you'll probably notice the shortcuts. You'll notice the coincidences. You'll notice moments where the story seems to rely more on momentum than deduction. But if you're approaching it as an adventure with mystery elements, those issues become much easier to overlook. What surprised me most is that the emotional mystery often landed harder than the literal one. Finding Euphoria isn't just a puzzle, it's personal. Every clue carries emotional weight because Enola isn't trying to solve a case for money or reputation. She's trying to find someone she loves. That emotional investment does a lot of heavy lifting throughout the film. Even when the detective mechanics aren't firing on all cylinders, the audience still has a reason to care. Then there's Tewksbury's storyline, which introduces a different kind of mystery altogether. It's less about discovery and more about danger. Less about intellectual curiosity and more about survival. That shift changes the tone quite a bit. At times, the movie almost feels like it's transforming from a detective story into an adventure chase film. And honestly, I think that's probably the best way to describe the movie overall. Not as a mystery that happens to contain adventure, but as an adventure that happens to contain mystery. That distinction explains so much about why audiences responded to it differently. Because when people walked into Enola Holmes', many of them expected Sherlock Holmes-style detective storytelling. What they got instead was something lighter, faster, and far more character-focused. Whether that's a strength or a weakness will depend entirely on what you wanted from the movie. Personally, I found the mysteries functional rather than exceptional. They kept the story moving, they created stakes, they gave Enola opportunities to grow. But when I think back on the film, I don't remember the clues first. I don't remember the reveals first. I remember Enola. And in a strange way, that might tell you everything you need to know about how this movie approaches the detective genre. The mysteries are important. The detective work is important, but neither one is truly the star of the show. And honestly, I think this is where Enola Holmes wins over a lot of people. Not with the mystery, not with the social commentary, not even with the Holmes connection. It wins people over because it's simply trying very hard to be entertaining. That might sound like a small compliment, but it really isn't. There are plenty of movies that become so focused on being clever or important that they forget to be enjoyable. Enola Holmes never really has that problem. Even when parts of the story don't fully work, the movie is almost always trying to keep things moving. The adventure side of the film is probably the clearest example of that. Once Enola leaves home, the movie settles into a surprisingly energetic rhythm. New locations appear, new threats emerge, new people enter the story. One minute she's following clues, the next she's escaping danger, then she's disguising herself, hopping trains, sneaking through unfamiliar places, or trying to stay one step ahead of someone who wants her caught. There's a constant sense of forward motion. Now, whether that motion always leads somewhere satisfying is a separate conversation, but it does keep the film from feeling stagnant. What I found interesting is that the adventure rarely feels grand in the traditional blockbuster sense. The stakes matter to Enola, obviously, but the movie doesn't constantly stop to remind us that the fate of the world hangs in the balance. Most of the time, the story feels much more personal than that, and I think that's part of its charm. This isn't a hero trying to save civilization. It's a teenager trying to navigate a world that's suddenly become a lot bigger and more dangerous than she expected. That perspective makes the adventure feel more approachable. Then there's the humor, and I have to admit, a lot of the comedy sneaks up on you. The film isn't built around punchlines. Nobody's standing around waiting for applause after delivering a joke. Instead, most of the humor comes from Enola herself. The way she reacts to situations, the way she comments on things, the way she occasionally looks at the audience as if to say, "Can you believe this?" Those moments give the movie a lightness that helps balance some of its heavier themes. because if you stripped away all the humor, parts of this story would actually be surprisingly serious. Missing parents, family conflict, violence, questions about identity and independence. There's a lot happening underneath the surface. The comedy keeps everything accessible. It keeps the movie from becoming overly self-important. And honestly, that's one reason younger audiences seem to connect with it so easily. The film never feels like it's talking down to them, but it also never feels like it's trying to overwhelm them. Then we get to the action, and this is where Enola Holmes starts feeling very different from what some people probably expected when they saw the title, because there are moments where the movie drifts surprisingly far from traditional detective fiction. There are chase sequences, physical confrontations, escapes, hand-to-hand fights, moments where Enola has to rely on training and instinct rather than deduction. Some viewers loved that. Others were less enthusiastic. I can understand both reactions. If you're coming to the movie because you want classic Holmes-style problem-solving, seeing characters punch their way through situations might feel a little out of place. But if you're approaching it as a young adult adventure, the action makes a lot more sense. It gives the story energy, it raises the stakes, it creates situations where Enola has to prove she can handle herself. And to the movie's credit, she doesn't emerge from every encounter looking invincible. She gets scared, she gets hurt, she gets overwhelmed. That vulnerability helps keep the action grounded, at least most of the time. One thing I noticed while reading different reactions to the film is that people often described it using completely different genres. Some called it a mystery. Others called it a family film. Some saw it as a coming-of-age story. Others treated it like a period adventure. And honestly, they're all kind of right. The movie spends so much time borrowing elements from different genres that it becomes difficult to place neatly into just one category. Sometimes that's messy. Sometimes it creates tonal hiccups. But it also makes the film surprisingly accessible. There's usually something happening that can hold your attention, even if one particular element isn't fully working for you. Didn't care about the mystery? Maybe the adventure kept you invested. Didn't care about the action? Maybe the humor worked. Didn't care about either. You probably still had Enola herself, and that's ultimately why the entertainment factor lands better than some of the individual components. Not every joke works, not every action sequence is memorable, not every adventure detour feels necessary. But the film rarely sits still long enough for those issues to completely derail the experience. It's constantly finding new ways to engage the audience. Some succeed more than others, but the effort is always there. And by the end, even viewers who had major issues with the mystery or the screenplay often found themselves admitting something interesting. They had fun. Maybe not the kind of fun they expected when they saw the name Holmes attached to the title, but fun nonetheless. And sometimes that's a bigger achievement than people give the movie credit for. Now, this is probably where Enola Holmes-ish becomes a much harder movie to evaluate, because the further I got away from the experience of watching it and started thinking about how it was actually put together, the more I found myself torn. There are things about the screenplay that work surprisingly well, and there are other things that feel like they were held together by pure momentum. What's strange is that both can be true at the same time. While watching the film, I was rarely bored. That's important. For a movie that runs over 2 hours and spends a lot of that time introducing a new character, a new corner of the Holmes universe, multiple mysteries, family drama, social commentary, and a coming-of-age story, it moves with a lot of confidence. Maybe sometimes too much confidence. Because if you stop and examine the structure closely, you start noticing how many different things the movie is trying to juggle at once. There's Enola searching for her mother. There's the conflict with Mycroft. There's her relationship with Sherlock. There's Tewksbury's situation. There's the larger political backdrop. There's Enola discovering her own identity. And then there are all the various clues, chases, disguises, escapes, and side encounters happening along the way. That's a lot. In fact, there were moments where I felt like the movie had enough material for 2 separate stories. One centered entirely on Eudoria's disappearance. Another centered on Tewksbury's danger. Instead, the film decides to tell both simultaneously. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. The advantage is obvious. There's always something happening. If one storyline slows down, another can pick up the pace. The downside is that neither mystery always gets the attention it deserves. Just when you're becoming invested in one thread, the film cuts away to focus on another. Then it comes back. Then it leaves again. Eventually you adjust to the rhythm, but it can create the feeling that the movie is constantly changing lanes, not crashing, just weaving. And then there's the question of pacing. This was one of the most divisive aspects of the film among viewers. Some people thought it moved quickly and never dragged. Others thought it was overlong and unfocused. Honestly, I can see why both groups walked away with those impressions. Because the pacing is fast on a scene-to-scene level. Something is always happening. Characters are always moving. Information is constantly arriving. But narrative momentum and activity aren't exactly the same thing. There are stretches where the film covers a lot of ground without necessarily deepening the story. You feel movement without always feeling progression. That's a subtle difference, but it's there. Another thing I kept noticing was how often the screenplay relies on convenience. Not constantly, not enough to completely break the movie, but enough that it becomes noticeable. Characters occasionally appear at exactly the right moment. Important discoveries arrive surprisingly easily. Certain obstacles seem to resolve themselves just when the story needs them to. Again, these aren't fatal flaws. Adventure films have survived on coincidence for decades. But when you're operating inside a universe associated with Sherlock Holmes, audiences naturally expect clever solutions more than convenient ones. That's a very high standard to inherit. And I don't think Enola Holmes always clears that bar. The film often succeeds because of charm rather than precision, because of personality rather than airtight plotting, because of enthusiasm rather than meticulous construction. And weirdly enough, that's not always a bad thing. Some movies are engineered. This one often feels improvised, even when it clearly isn't. Then, we get into tone. And honestly, tone might be the trickiest thing the screenplay attempts. At any given moment, Enola Holmes can be a family adventure, a detective story, a coming-of-age drama, a comedy, a social commentary piece, or an action film, sometimes all within the same 20 minutes. That's an ambitious balancing act. There were moments where I thought the movie pulled it off remarkably well. A funny scene transitions into something emotional. An action sequence leads into a character moment. A mystery clue becomes an opportunity for humor. When it works, the film feels lively and unpredictable. When it doesn't, it can feel like several different movies competing for screen time. I suspect a lot of the audience disagreement surrounding Enola Holmes comes from this exact issue. People aren't always reacting to the same movie. Some viewers connect most strongly with the adventure. Others care about the mystery. Others focus on the themes. Others just enjoy spending time with the characters. The film contains all of those elements, but not everyone values them equally. That's why one person sees a charming, fast-moving adventure, while another sees a messy, overstuffed narrative. They're both looking at the same film. They're just responding to different parts of it. And honestly, I think that's what makes the screenplay so fascinating to discuss. It's not clean. It's not perfectly structured. It's not the kind of script that leaves you marveling at its precision. But it's also never lifeless, never mechanical, never predictable in the way some carefully assembled franchise films can become. The movie occasionally trips over its own ambitions. It reaches for more than it can comfortably hold. Yet somehow, largely because of the character at its center, it keeps moving forward anyway. And by the end, I found myself in an unusual position. I could list quite a few structural problems. I could point to pacing issues. I could highlight plot conveniences. I could even argue that the screenplay never fully capitalizes on its strongest ideas. But I also couldn't deny that I remained invested throughout most of the journey, which may be the most revealing thing I can say about the writing. It doesn't always earn your admiration, but more often than not, it manages to keep your attention, and those aren't quite the same thing. There's one thing in Enola Holmes that people seem to react to almost immediately. Not the mystery, not Sherlock, not even the feminist themes. It's the fact that Enola keeps looking directly at the camera. And honestly, I get why it's such a talking point. Breaking the fourth wall is one of those storytelling devices that either clicks with you almost instantly or starts irritating you within the first 10 minutes. There doesn't seem to be much middle ground. Personally, when the movie started doing it, I wasn't completely sold. Maybe that's because so many films and shows have used the technique over the years that it can feel a little like a shortcut. A character glances at the audience, makes a witty observation, and suddenly we're supposed to feel connected to them. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it feels like the cinematic equivalent of somebody constantly nudging you and asking, "You get it, right?" At first, I wasn't sure which version Enola Holmes was aiming for, but something interesting happened. The longer the movie went on, the less I noticed the technique itself, and the more I started focusing on what it was actually doing for the character. Because Enola isn't really using those moments to deliver jokes all the time. She's thinking out loud, she's sharing observations, she's letting us in on things she wouldn't necessarily say to the people around her. There's a subtle difference there. It turns the audience into something closer to a travel companion than a spectator. Instead of watching Enola from a distance, we're kind of riding alongside her. And I think that's a big reason why so many viewers ended up finding her immediately likable. The film establishes a relationship between Enola and the audience very quickly, much faster than it could have through dialogue alone. Within minutes, you understand how her mind works, what frustrates her, what excites her, what she notices, what she fears. And because of that, even when the plot becomes a little chaotic, you rarely lose track of her emotional perspective. Now, that doesn't mean the device works for everyone. Far from it. I've seen plenty of people who found it distracting. Some thought it felt gimmicky. Others felt it pulled them out of the story every time it happened. And honestly, I don't think those criticisms are unfair. There are moments where the film leans on the technique quite heavily. If you're already skeptical of fourth wall breaks as a storytelling tool, Enola Holmes probably isn't going to change your mind. It's committed to the bit. Very committed. What makes it fascinating, though, is how much of the film's personality is tied to those moments. Imagine removing them entirely. The plot would still function, the mystery would still exist, the action scenes would still happen, but the movie would feel completely different. Colder maybe, more conventional, less playful. A lot of Enola's charm comes from the fact that she's constantly inviting us into her world rather than simply performing inside it. And I think that's why the device succeeds more often than it fails. Not because it's innovative. It isn't. Not because it's subtle. It definitely isn't. But because it feels connected to who Enola is. She's curious, observant, expressive. She wants to understand the world around her, so it somehow makes sense that she'd want to bring us along for the process. There's also another benefit that doesn't get discussed enough. The film asks us to spend a lot of time with Enola. Almost every scene revolves around her in some way. That's a huge burden for any protagonist. The audience has to enjoy being in that person's company for over 2 hours. The direct-to-camera moments help with that. They create familiarity. By the midpoint of the film, it doesn't feel like you're watching a stranger anymore. It feels like you're listening to someone tell you a story. And that's a surprisingly effective trick. Of course, there are times when the movie probably gets a little too comfortable with it. A few moments feel less necessary than others. There were occasions where I wondered whether a scene would have been stronger if it had trusted the visuals or the performance instead of having Enola explain what she was thinking. But those moments never completely derailed the experience for me. Mostly because Millie Bobby Brown sells them. That's the part people sometimes overlook. A fourth wall break isn't automatically charming. The actor has to make it feel natural. If the performance is off by even a small amount, the whole thing can collapse into self-awareness for its own sake. Brown somehow avoids that trap. Even when she's speaking directly to the audience, she rarely feels like she's performing at us. It feels more like she's sharing something with us. And that distinction ends up making all the difference. By the end of the movie, I wasn't really evaluating the fourth wall breaks anymore. I was evaluating whether I enjoyed spending time with Enola. And in a strange way, that's probably the strongest compliment I can give the device. The technique itself eventually disappears. All that's left is the character. And for a movie built almost entirely around one character's journey, that's exactly what you want. One thing that almost nobody seems to argue about when it comes to Enola Holmes is how good the movie looks. You can debate the mystery. You can debate the themes. You can debate whether Sherlock should even have a sister in the first place. But visually, the film is pretty easy on the eyes. Actually, more than that. It's the kind of movie that understands how important presentation is when you're trying to build a world that audiences want to spend 2 hours inside. And from the opening scenes, that's exactly what it does. The first thing that stood out to me was how inviting everything feels. A lot of period pieces fall into one of two traps. They either become obsessed with historical authenticity and end up feeling stiff, or they become so stylized that the setting starts resembling a theme park version of history. Enola Holmes somehow lands somewhere in the middle. It doesn't feel dusty. It doesn't feel academic. It doesn't feel like it's desperately trying to teach you a history lesson. It feels alive. The houses feel lived in. The streets feel busy. The locations have personality. Even when the movie is jumping between different places, there's usually enough visual detail to make each environment feel distinct. And honestly, I think that's part of why the adventure works as well as it does. The world itself feels worth exploring. You're not just following Enola. You're discovering Victorian England through her eyes, or at least a version of Victorian England filtered through the film's playful perspective. The production design deserves a lot of credit for that. The costumes are excellent without constantly screaming for attention. The set decoration feels rich without becoming distracting. Every room seems to tell you something about the people who occupy it. The contrast between Enola's upbringing and the more rigid parts of society is often communicated visually before anyone even says a word. That's always something I appreciate, when a movie trusts the environment to do part of the storytelling. Then there's the cinematography, and what I liked most is that the film rarely treats the setting like a museum exhibit. The camera moves, the frame feels energetic. There's a lightness to the visual language that matches Enola's personality. This could have easily been shot in a much more traditional manner. Locked-down camera work, formal compositions, lots of emphasis on historical grandeur. Instead, the movie often feels surprisingly modern in how it presents itself. Not modern in a distracting way, just accessible, approachable. It wants you to have fun, and the visuals reflect that. Even the color palette contributes to that feeling. There's a warmth running through much of the film that prevents it from becoming cold or overly serious. You get the sense that the filmmakers wanted audiences to enjoy spending time in this world rather than merely admire it from a distance. That distinction matters, because visual beauty alone doesn't automatically create immersion. Plenty of movies look expensive, far fewer feel welcoming. Another thing I noticed is how often the filmmaking seems designed around momentum. Harry Bradbeer directs the movie with a lot of energy. Sometimes that energy works beautifully. Sometimes it feels like the film is moving so quickly that it doesn't always stop to absorb a moment. But even when I had issues with certain story decisions, I rarely felt like the movie lacked enthusiasm. There's an eagerness to the filmmaking, a sense that everyone involved genuinely wants the audience to enjoy the ride. You can feel that in the editing. You can feel it in the transitions. You can feel it in the way scenes are staged. The film doesn't sit around admiring itself for very long. It's always trying to pull you toward the next thing. Now, I will say that there were moments where the visual style occasionally felt a little more polished than the story itself, and I don't necessarily mean that as criticism. Sometimes the production value is so consistently strong that it almost smooths over narrative bumps. You might find yourself enjoying a sequence because of how it's presented, even if what's actually happening isn't especially remarkable. That's not the worst problem a movie can have. If anything, it's evidence of how much care went into the craftsmanship. What impressed me most, though, is how clearly the filmmakers understood the tone they were aiming for. This isn't trying to be a gritty detective thriller. It's not trying to be a dark Victorian drama. It's not trying to recreate the atmosphere of every Sherlock Holmes adaptation that came before it. The visual style is built around Enola. Curious, energetic, optimistic, occasionally chaotic. The world looks the way it feels to her. And because of that, the filmmaking and the character end up working hand in hand. By the end of the movie, I wasn't thinking about individual camera angles or costume details. I was thinking about how comfortable the film felt in its own identity. That's harder to achieve than it sounds. A lot of spin-offs spend their entire runtime trying to imitate the franchise they're connected to. Enola Holmes-ish doesn't really do that. It borrows the world, then it paints it in its own colors. And whether you loved the story or found parts of it frustrating, there's something undeniably appealing about the confidence with which it creates that world. It's bright, it's energetic, it's inviting. And in many ways, the visual storytelling succeeds at exactly what the movie itself is trying to do, make you want to follow Enola wherever she goes next. I think one of the biggest reasons people had such wildly different reactions to Enola Holmes is because a lot of them walked into completely different movies. Not literally, obviously, but expectations play a huge role in how you experience something like this. If you hear Holmes and immediately start thinking about intricate detective stories, razor-sharp deductions, and complicated mysteries that demand your full attention, there's a good chance Enola Holmes-ish catches you off guard. Because despite the title, despite the famous surname, and despite Sherlock himself showing up from time to time, this movie is operating on a very different wavelength. It's much lighter, much warmer, and honestly, much more interested in being enjoyable than impressive. That sounds harsher than I mean it. What I'm really saying is that the film understands exactly who it's trying to entertain, and unlike a lot of modern franchise projects, it rarely seems embarrassed about that. There's a certain comfort to Enola Holmes-ish. You know those movies that feel like they were made for a rainy afternoon? The kind of film you stumble across, throw on without overthinking it, and end up having a pretty good time with? This has that energy. It's not constantly trying to convince you of its importance. It's not demanding that you admire its brilliance every 5 minutes. It just wants to tell a story and keep you engaged. Sometimes that's enough. Actually, sometimes that's more difficult than people realize, because creating something genuinely entertaining without relying on endless spectacle isn't easy. And I think that's where the movie quietly succeeds, not necessarily through any one individual element, but through the way all the pieces work together. The mystery keeps things moving, the humor keeps things light, the characters keep things personal, the adventure keeps things energetic. Even when one element stumbles, another usually steps in to keep the momentum alive. That's a big reason why so many viewers describe the film as fun, even when they had criticisms. The movie has flaws. Most people seem to agree on that. But it also has a knack for remaining watchable. That's not always the same thing as being great, but it's still valuable. Now, the audience question is interesting, because the film is very clearly aimed at younger viewers. I don't think that's controversial. You can feel it in the tone, you can feel it in the pacing, you can feel it in the way the story approaches its themes. This isn't a cynical observation either. The movie knows who it's talking to, and for the most part, it talks to them with respect. That's probably why younger audiences connected with Enola so strongly. She's smart, capable, funny, and independent, but she's also still figuring things out. The movie never treats her like a finished product, and that makes her relatable. At the same time, what's interesting is how many older viewers ended up enjoying the film, despite clearly not being the target demographic. I've seen plenty of reactions from people who openly admitted, "This wasn't made for me," and then followed that statement by saying they still had a good time. I think that's because the movie never becomes exclusionary. It might be focused on younger audiences, but it doesn't shut everyone else out. There's enough charm, enough energy, and enough personality to keep a broader audience invested. Now, of course, not everyone responded that way. Some viewers found the tone too lightweight. Some wanted a darker mystery. Some wanted a more traditional Sherlock Holmes story. Others felt the film occasionally drifted into territory that felt a little too modern or a little too self-aware. And honestly, those reactions make sense too, because the movie isn't trying to satisfy every audience simultaneously. It's making a choice, a very deliberate one. It's choosing optimism over cynicism, adventure over realism, accessibility over complexity. And whenever a film makes choices that specific, some viewers are inevitably going to be left behind. That's just the trade-off. What I find most fascinating, though, is that people often agree on the movie's qualities while disagreeing on whether those qualities are strengths or weaknesses. One person calls it lighthearted, another calls it shallow, one person says it's breezy, another says it's lacking depth, one person says it's charming, another says it's simplistic. They're often describing the exact same thing, they're just responding to it differently. That's usually a sign that a movie has a pretty clear identity. Whether you like that identity is another matter entirely, and by the time the credits rolled, that's where I landed with Enola Holmes. I don't think it's trying to be the definitive mystery film. I don't think it's trying to reinvent detective storytelling. What it wants to be is an entertaining adventure centered around a character people enjoy spending time with. Simple goal. Not necessarily easy to achieve, but a clear goal. And honestly, the film succeeds at that more often than it doesn't. You may not remember every clue. You may not remember every twist. You may even forget parts of the larger plot. But there's a good chance you'll remember how the movie made you feel while watching it. Comfortable, engaged, occasionally amused, curious about what happens next. And for the audience this film was aiming for, that's probably exactly what it needed to accomplish. One of the most telling things about Enola Holmes is that even people who had problems with it often ended up saying the same thing. I'd still watch another one. And honestly, that's kind of fascinating, because if you read enough reactions to the film, you'll find plenty of criticism. People question the mystery, they question some of the writing choices, they question the pacing. Some weren't sold on certain character interpretations. Others thought the story never fully capitalized on its strongest ideas. Yet somehow, a surprising number of those same people still wanted a sequel. That's usually a sign that a movie has done something right, maybe not everything right, but something. Because audiences generally don't ask for more of something they completely dislike. What I think happened with Enola Holmes is that the film managed to create a character people enjoyed spending time with, even when they weren't entirely convinced by the specific story surrounding her. And there's a big difference between those two things. A weak story can be fixed. A weak protagonist is much harder to recover from. With Enola, the foundation already feels solid. By the end of the movie, you understand who she is. You understand her strengths, her flaws, her curiosity, her stubbornness, her sense of independence. Whether every plot point worked or not, the character herself feels established. That's a huge advantage if you're thinking long-term. Because once a franchise has a protagonist audiences genuinely care about, future stories don't have to spend nearly as much time introducing the world or explaining the rules. They can just get moving. And that's something I found myself thinking about quite a bit while watching. A lot of Enola Holmes feels like setup, not in a negative way, just structurally. The movie has a lot of work to do. It has to introduce Enola, introduce her family, explain her relationship with her mother, establish the Holmes connection, build the world, create the tone, set up the themes. And somewhere in between all of that, it still has to tell an actual story. That's a heavy workload for a first installment. Sometimes you can feel that weight. There are moments where the film seems to be laying track while simultaneously trying to drive the train, which is why I think some viewers came away with the feeling that the concept was occasionally stronger than the execution. The ingredients are there. The character works, the world works, the tone mostly works. The question becomes what happens when the filmmakers no longer have to spend half the runtime introducing everything. What happens when Enola simply gets a new case? That's an exciting prospect. In fact, several of the criticisms people had about the first film are exactly the kind of problems that sequels often solve naturally. A stronger mystery, a tighter structure, more confidence in the storytelling, less origin story, more adventure. You can almost see the shape of that possibility while watching the movie, and I think audiences sensed it too. Another thing working in the franchise's favor is that Enola exists in a world that's already larger than the story being told. The film only scratches the surface of certain relationships. There's more to explore with Sherlock, more to explore with Mycroft, more to explore with her mother. Even characters like Tewksbury feel like people who could easily return without it feeling forced. The universe feels expandable. Not in the modern franchise sense where every side character needs a spin-off and 3 streaming series. Just in the sense that it feels lived in. There are corners of the world we haven't seen yet, cases we haven't followed, adventures we haven't experienced, and that naturally creates curiosity. What I also appreciate is that the film doesn't end by pretending Enola has become a perfect detective overnight. She's still learning, still evolving, still figuring things out. That's important because it leaves room for growth. Some franchises accidentally trap themselves by making their heroes too capable too quickly. Once a character has mastered everything, future stories become much harder to build. Enola avoids that problem. She's talented, but she's still developing. Confident, but not finished. That's exactly where you want a franchise lead to be. Of course, potential and execution aren't the same thing. Every movie with sequel potential doesn't automatically become a great series. We've seen plenty of promising starts lead nowhere. But if we're talking purely about whether Enola Holmes earns the right to continue, I think the answer is yes. Not because the first film is flawless. Actually, almost the opposite. Because it feels like a world that still has somewhere to go. Some movies tell a complete story and leave you satisfied. Others leave you curious. Enola Holmes falls firmly into that second category. When the credits rolled, I wasn't necessarily thinking about the mystery that had just been solved. I found myself wondering what Enola would do next. And when a movie leaves you asking that question, it's already halfway toward becoming a franchise. So after sitting with Enola Holmes for a while, after thinking about the mystery, the characters, the themes, the pacing, and all the little things that worked and the things that didn't, I keep coming back to a fairly simple conclusion. This is a movie that's easier to enjoy than it is to dissect. And I don't mean that as a criticism. In fact, I think that's probably one of the reasons it connected with so many people. Because if you start examining every piece of the machinery, you'll find issues, you'll find plot conveniences. You'll find mysteries that aren't as clever as they first appear. You'll find story threads that could have been developed more deeply. you'll find pacing decisions that don't always land. There are moments where the screenplay reaches for something bigger than it can fully deliver. Moments where the movie seems more interested in moving forward than slowing down and earning a particular emotional beat or revelation. Those criticisms are real. I felt them while watching. But what's equally real is the fact that the film remains remarkably easy to like, and that's a surprisingly difficult quality to manufacture. A lot of movies today seem designed by committee. Every scene feels engineered. Every emotional moment feels calculated. Every character arc feels like it was tested and adjusted until all the rough edges disappeared. Enola Holmes doesn't feel like that. It's polished, sure, but it's also a little messy, a little uneven, sometimes overly ambitious, sometimes overly eager. And strangely enough, those imperfections make it feel more human. The movie genuinely believes in its main character. You can feel that in almost every scene. Whether the mystery is working or not, whether the action lands or not, whether the themes resonate or not, the film never loses faith in Enola. Thankfully, neither does the audience, because at the end of the day, Millie Bobby Brown really is the secret ingredient holding everything together. I've mentioned her throughout this review, but it's impossible not to circle back to that performance one final time. The film asks her to carry a tremendous amount of weight, not just screen time, expectation, tone, emotion, humor, narration, character development. She's responsible for making this entire experiment work, and somehow she does. Even viewers who disagreed on almost everything else seem to arrive at that same conclusion. The mystery? Mixed reactions. The themes? Mixed reactions. Sherlock's portrayal? Mixed reactions. The pacing? Definitely mixed reactions. Millie Bobby Brown? That was the closest thing this movie had to universal praise, and honestly, that says a lot, because if the lead performance had been weaker, many of the film's flaws would have become impossible to ignore. Instead, she creates enough goodwill that the audience is often willing to follow the movie through its rougher patches. That doesn't make those issues disappear, but it does make them easier to forgive. The supporting cast deserves credit as well. The production design deserves credit. The visual style deserves credit. There are a lot of individual pieces here that work, maybe not perfectly, but consistently enough to create something entertaining, and I think that's the word I keep landing on. Entertaining, not groundbreaking, not definitive, not the greatest mystery ever put on screen, just genuinely entertaining. Sometimes we treat that like faint praise. It isn't. Entertainment is the entire job. Everything else is a bonus. What's interesting is that Enola Holmes-esque ended up creating a strange kind of divide among audiences. The people who wanted a traditional Sherlock Holmes story often seemed less enthusiastic. The people willing to accept it as an Enola Holmes story generally had a much better time. And honestly, I think the movie itself understands that distinction. It isn't trying to compete with every Sherlock adaptation that came before it. It isn't trying to replace Sherlock. It isn't trying to prove that Enola is somehow the superior detective. It's simply trying to carve out a space of its own, a lighter space, a younger space, a more adventurous space. Sometimes it succeeds brilliantly. Sometimes it stumbles, but at least it has its own identity. That's more than can be said for a lot of franchise spin-offs. By the time the credits rolled, I wasn't thinking about whether the mystery was airtight. I wasn't thinking about historical accuracy. I wasn't even thinking about which version of Sherlock Holmes I preferred. I was thinking about Enola. And that's probably the clearest indication of what this film gets right. It introduces a new character into one of the most famous fictional universes ever created and somehow makes her feel like she belongs there. Not because she's a copy of Sherlock. Not because she's trying to replace him. Because she's her own person. For me, that's the film's biggest success. The mystery may not always satisfy. The screenplay may occasionally wander. The themes may be more direct than some viewers would prefer. But the character works. And once that happens, a lot of the movie's other flaws become much easier to live with. So if you're looking for a classic Sherlock Holmes mystery, this probably isn't the film you're looking for. If you're looking for a fun, charming, occasionally messy adventure led by a genuinely engaging protagonist, there's a very good chance you'll understand why so many people ended up enjoying it. Maybe not because it's perfect, but because it's surprisingly easy to spend time with. And sometimes that's exactly enough.